Let me draw another graph. This time the inputs that we have is 3 hours of time, 1 TV, and 1 textbook. And then the production process, or also we call it technology, right? Even though it could be a manual process, we still call it technology, is 1 TV program per hour. The programs are 1 hour long, just to keep it simple, and 1 textbook chapter the first hour. Notice my change of wording there, that was on purpose. This time we'll start with a graph and skip the table altogether. On the vertical axis, TV watching. And we're going to measure that in programs, 1 hour programs. And then on the horizontal axis, we're going to measure textbook reading, and we're going to count that in chapters. Let's say it's our favorite TV watching evening of the week, and we devote all 3 hours to watching TV, then we will be at this point. And again, I'll start plotting the points, then I connect the points with a curve. But then we start to feel a little bit guilty, so we say, well, I'm going to devote 1 hour to reading the textbook. So in watching 2 hours of TV, you will watch 2 programs. Let's assume you time it correctly to watch 2 full programs. And you will read 1 chapter of the textbook. So you will read at that point. After you read a chapter, you get all motivated and say, I will only watch 1 hour of TV and read the textbook for 2 hours. And you assume very optimistically that, hey, it took me 1 hour to read the first chapter, I'll probably read the second chapter, a full second chapter in the second hour. But I'm trying to come up with a realistic example, and a realistic assumption would be that, heck no, the second hour in front of the textbook you will have to give up a full program of TV because you're watching TV 1 program per hour, no matter what. But regarding reading the textbook, the first hour you'll read 1 chapter, the second hour you will probably read just half a chapter. And then if you say, just read the textbook, you will watch no TV, that's 0 programs, and devote a 3rd hour to reading the textbook. The 3rd hour you probably just read a quarter of a chapter or more, so you probably didn't even finish the second chapter. Your PPF curve will look something like that. In this case, the curve is actually curved as opposed to our previous PPF, which was actually a straight line. This is a curved PPF as opposed to a straight line PPF, and that means that the choices, the trade-offs, and the opportunity costs are not constant. Here, when I say trade-offs, I just mean choices. And I call it trade-off because there are actual choices between 2 things. You can't get, again, if you're on the curve and you're being efficient, you can't get more of one without having to give up some of the other. That's what we call them, choices or trade-offs. And in this case, because it's curved, they're not constant. And why is that? They're not constant because the input, 3 hours, does not produce the same level of output at every point. With TV programs, yes. With textbook reading, unfortunately, that's not the case. The first hour you get 1 chapter, the second hour you get half a chapter, and the 3rd hour you get barely a quarter more. In 3 hours, you end up reading 1 and 3/4 chapters based on this example. Every input hour time does not give you the same level of output, and that's why you have a curved PPF. That often happens in the real world. So when I say a typical PPF, I mean a curved PPF, not a straight line PPF. Straight line PPF occurs a lot, especially if we're talking about cooking and recipes. I mentioned that in the previous video. If we're talking about gasoline and it takes you a quarter tank of gas to get to Ocala and back, let's say you have a gas guzzler, it will take you a quarter tank of gas no matter if you start with a full tank of gas or half a tank of gas. It will take you still a quarter tank of gas to go back and forth to Ocala, assuming that it's the same time of the day and the same traffic conditions. In this case, each period of time does not give you the same textbook you already used 1 hour of your time, the second hour will not give you the same output reading. The other thing that we illustrate, as just like the straight line PPF, is scarcity. Again, we have an impossible area and a possible area. The possible area is divided between the possible and efficient and the possible and inefficient. Impossible because we deal with scarcity, we don't have enough time. We might have enough of the textbook and enough TV, but in the case one of the resources is constrained. The only way we can move this curve out is with more inputs. In this case, the only way we can move this PPF out is with more time. And if we have more time, if we have a lot of time available, then we might be constrained. Another product, another input may be scarce. Only more inputs move PPF out. If we're talking about several economic goods or services, we might call that also movement out of the PPF is economic growth. We call that economic growth. Can the curve shrink? Yes. But the curve will only shrink for the opposite reason. In other words, the curve only moves out if you have additional resources. You discover additional resources. You invent additional technology and so on and so forth. The curve will shrink only if the inputs are eliminated. If we're talking about workers, only if the workers die. If we're talking about buildings, only if the buildings are destroyed. A tornado hits, a hurricane hits, there's an earthquake, a bomb falls from the sky. By nature or by mankind, inputs are destroyed, and that causes a shrinkage. Not using the inputs, leaving a can open, doesn't mean that the curve shrinks. That means that you're being inefficient. PPF illustrates the state of economy. We're not trying to assign blame here. We're not trying to come up with excuses. And if we have the resources and we're not using them for whatever reason that's wasteful, and we'll illustrate that with a point. The only thing that shrinks the curve is the elimination. Death, destruction, plague. The shrinking of the curve illustrates economic contraction. The other thing I wanted to describe is if you have anything that is caused for you not using your resources. Let's say a student at Santa Fe is going to their advisor and she's very good at welding and wants to pursue one of our welding certificates. And her advisor says, welding? I mean, come on, you're a girl. And so he's actually discouraging this female student from pursuing her option, her degree. And the question I wanted to pose to you was how do you illustrate that on this PPF? And imagine that it's auto bodies and plumbing. And so this female student is discouraged from going to welding. She wants to recommend that perhaps she should go to accounting or another profession like that, which will be employed in these industries. Auto bodies and plumbing firms also need accountants and need lawyers and need infirmaries and doctors and so on and so forth. But she's not able to pursue her profession. And so how do we illustrate that here? Definitely it's not a point outside the curve, and it's not a curve expanding. Is it a curve shrinking? And if you assume that the curve is shrinking because she's not available to actually pursue her trade, and which we're assuming that if it's something she likes, she's much better at. And the way you illustrate on that curve is not with the curve shrinking because she's there. She's alive and kicking. You illustrate it with a point inside the curve, and that's what we call discrimination, which is inefficient. In this course, we argue against discrimination, not on all the other grounds you could argue against discrimination, on moral and ethical grounds, but we argue it on simply economic self-interest. We want to be out here. We want to be efficient because we want the best products at the cheapest price. And to do that, we have to be on the efficient frontier. If we're here, we're all suffering. Products that are either more expensive or worse, that are of worse quality. The PPF also illustrates the cost of discrimination.